A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hello, everybody. Paula Escuadra has spent over 12 years elevating the power games have to redefine their relationship with failure and create meaning. She's our guest today. And we are here to hopefully deal with failure and create meaning. Well, that's actually not the only thing we're here for, but why not? She leads research for Xbox Game Studios Cloud Publishing, helping developers make great games that foster meaningful communities. She co-founded the IGTA's Climate Special Interest Group, which we got to get into today, co-authoring its newly released Environmental Game Design Playbook. She's also on the Cologne Game Labs Advisory Board with a focus on unlocking sustainability competencies in the next generation of game developers. We're here to talk environment. As you can tell, Paula is deeply, deeply in this. And finally, she's a very strong advocate for community care, psychological safety, and dog cuddling as a form of self-care. So if you're with your dog right now, we highly recommend you, make yourself very, very comfortable. All right, Paula, welcome to the show. Yay!
Yay! Thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of the support for dog cuddling.
All right. And I want to take a second actually just to say Andy's back. Andy has been gone over the last two shows. He's been taking care of his mother, being a wonderful son that he is. And Andy, I'm just really happy to have you back. It's just not the same doing this alone.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm really, really glad to be back. And this one's going to be really fun. And I'm super excited to be here again.
All right. Okay. So, Paula, tell us about the International Game Developers Association Climate Special Interest Group. What does the group do? What do you guys do?
Sure. That's a very good question. So the IGTA Climate SIG, which is the way shorter and easier way to say it, is really a grassroots volunteer organization within the video game industry that's meant to make sustainability more accessible throughout the places that we work. And in order for us to make and play games for the foreseeable future, we have to consider, business, social, environmental risks. And a lot of what we experience when we talk about sustainability in general, not just in the video game space, I think a lot of us deal with a lot of paralysis. There's so many things that we could be doing. There's so many options in front of us to act. And it's a major existential threat that all of us have to face on top of our day jobs or need to pay the bills, the need to be good parents to our kids and our dogs and cats. And we often get stuck in that feeling of fight, flight, or freeze that we do nothing, right? Like we burn out, we turtle into ourselves and focus on what we're able to handle in the day, which is a totally valid response to that level of anxiety. And so to break out of that, our hope is that we're creating a safe space so that game developers can come out of the woodwork who are ready to engage with this topic, are ready to find other people who can rally towards creating a more sustainable industry.
I want to add to that just to me, climate change is I think pretty clearly the greatest challenge of our time and the most complicated challenge. I think the complexity and size of this challenge can be so overwhelming. And it's really great when people are, not immediately overwhelmed by this and instead find practical ways for all of us to contribute to some sort of solution to the problem.
Yeah, that leadership is so important. That leadership is the people who, like you, who are not overwhelmed, who can show us how to make forward progress out of our overwhelmed states.
Folks can't see, but I am definitely laughing at the thought that I don't look overwhelmed. But I think that's really important. And I think that to reframe it a little bit, it's not just about leadership as individuals, it's leadership with us as a collective unit. And I think that part of the challenge that comes with us being ready or not ready to engage in the complex topic of the climate crisis is that a lot of the systems that we exist in, that we operate in, are not geared to face that problem. There's a whole talk we can probably get into about how capitalism has disabled us from being able to recognize how these systems are deeply connected, from our values to how we use products to how we operate in a society. It's a very complex problem.
Well, instead of talking about capitalism in the abstract, let's say, look, when I think about climate change, and, I've spent years talking about climate change with my students, the last thing I think about is video games. And yet, right, obviously operating games has an environmental impact. Not to mention, just working in an office, if you're a part of a design team, has an environmental impact. So either if you want to go down the capitalist route or any other route, how do game companies and their games impact the environment? So let's start with just general awareness of what the issue is.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about just the potential reach of it, games in today's climate, pun kind of intended, have a potential to reach 3 billion players all over the planet. And so when we think about what games can do for climate or are doing to climate, the environmental impact of that energy usage in itself is big enough of a topic to discuss. And our, creation of devices, our emphasis on making things more accessible to more people, and thinking about cloud and thinking about mobile, that has direct implications on the intensity of our carbon footprint. And so I think there was a Berkeley national study that had been done, I think 2018, by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, that validated that video games use more electricity than many home appliances. There's also, if we also take into account the carbon footprint of our supply chains and the minerals and petrochemicals that are used to create the platforms that our players use to access our ever increasing portfolio of content. We can also think about how there is huge variability in how these consoles are made, which has huge variability in their energy consumption. And it makes it very difficult for us to have like a clear and accurate estimate of our global footprint. But if we think about the ways in which platforms can also be used to access other types of media, like video, for instance, they're also not run efficiently for those purposes. There was a study, I believe it was by the University of Surrey, though I would have to verify, apologies, that because consoles were primarily built and optimized for gameplay, not things like movies and YouTube videos or Twitch streams, streaming videos on those devices can run 10 to 25 more times of electricity than using streaming devices.
Wow. So, I would have never guessed that would have been that much.
It's a lot. Yeah.
I'm going to think about that, given that I normally watch HBO through my Xbox, but I could watch it through my TV.
It is, yeah. And it's stuff that we don't often think about, because for us as consumers in general, like, energy is energy. Like I want it to be quick. I want it to be efficient. I want it to be fast. And I want to be able to get to exactly what I want. But I think that's also one of the reasons why like Xbox, for example, had implemented the energy saver mode that recently came out this year, and making that the default setting enables consoles to consume 20 times less power than the standard mode, which the standby mode does enable players to like more quickly turn on the console, but it's a difference of maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And so small changes like that, even if it feels really simple, actually have huge effects. And so when we think about cloud gaming and the ability to run on a data center that is dominantly run with clean or carbon neutral energy, that can play a massive role in video games footprint overall. One last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop talking at you, is that I think the cultural influence of that is actually also very important, because there are a lot of eyeballs, and a lot of the games that we build are inherently lenses of what we consider viable which is really great when you think about like the 90s and 2000s narratives that were dominantly about us and the apocalypse. And so in COVID, you're seeing a transition towards more cozy games, cooperative games, non-competitive games. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so let me just recap. There was a lot about consoles themselves, right? The making of consoles, the energy usage of consoles, right? Both the making and the continuing usage. Data centers, I would have thought would feature more, right? Because I'm assuming data centers are a huge consumer of energy.
100%. Yeah. But I think that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of questions that we need to answer when it comes to cloud streaming. Because if we take into consideration like data centers today, more often than not, many of them have to make a transition to clean energy. And if we think about hours of gameplay, because of those opportunities to be more efficient, there's a threshold at which cloud gaming itself still becomes more unsustainable than having a device directly in your home locally. But I think there was a there was a study from the University of Surrey that indicated that within 8 hours of consistent gameplay, it is more energy efficient compared to standard console. But there's still a lot to do. And at the end of the day, the fundamental question is, how are we powering our media and entertainment experiences, regardless of what platform you use?
I remember hearing about, I think, data centers that were in I think, Iceland, that were powered by geothermal and cool down as a way to kind of make much more sustainable data centers. Is that the sort of direction that you have in mind?
Oh, I mean, it certainly depends on the region.
Okay.
I don't know if California, for instance, could run on geothermal, because that would require mining into Yosemite, which I don't think most of us want to do.
Hey, I got my Yosemite cup right here. There you go.
And I think that's, oh my God, that was amazing. It certainly depends on the region, and it depends on how your grids were set up, which is why, public policy plays such a major role in our voting power matters. But accessing solar, accessing wind, accessing geothermal, I think rallying towards an overall plan and commitment to go clean energy across the board, regardless of the mechanism, I think is important for us and our resiliency long term.
And so it's not really so much about us as players choosing the right platform or choosing certain games over other games. It's really about us like coming together and making it and having a voice to say, hey, we want our energy to be clean energy for whatever we're using it for, whether we're playing games or doing laundry or both at the same time. Though
notice you've got two different communities, right? You're talking about one is the game companies, right? And this is where you're worried. This is where we get all these considerations about, right? Xbox moving to more cloud gaming. Is that good or bad for the environment, right? But then you've got those 3 billion people that you were talking about, and I love that you really kind of mentioned, and I'm assuming we're going to go deeper into it, the impact that games themselves have on our values, on the way we see the world, and how that could impact our views about the environment. How do you let's start with the game companies part first, and then, so let's deal with the kind of game professionals first, and then let's talk about the gamers.
Sure.
So how do you get game companies and game developers to care about the environment, to do something about the environment?
Yeah, that is a very good question that I get asked pretty much on a daily basis. So, I mean, context for the Climate Special Interest Group in particular, it's a wonderful global community of people of, I believe, over 400. I counted it yesterday. It was like 476 game developers and researchers and climate scientists who love and play games and make games, who have come together really first and foremost with the recognition that we can't make or play games if our electricity grids no longer work. We can't make or play games if our offices and homes are on fire or flooded. We can't hire diverse talent to create new narratives and new gameplay mechanics and innovate if they're in a situation where their base needs are not met because they're climate refugees. And that applies not only to the global south, it applies to industrialized nations. I have coworkers and anecdotes of people who've decided to move elsewhere outside of California because the fires are having impacts on their chronic health conditions. And so when we think about the visceral response that game developers have, it really starts out with that fear and the recognition that we have to do something. And the bias that people often have when they come in is the thought that, like, I just make games. I'm not saving the world. I'm not curing cancer. I'm not like in the trenches, like creating these solar plants. Like, what can I do? And we go back to the idea that, like, we have massive reach. Even like from the moment, the first game was ever built in the 1950s, we have had an influence in our like players and people's perceptions of how we view the world. And even though it feels like games are very small, the thing that I try to tell them before even the business case of it is that what the sustainability movement suffers from right now is that there are too many options that are too complex and not accessible. And games are really interesting because we have the ability to directly interact with world-breaking problems. And there's research that indicates that non-interactive forms of media, like books and film, are more effective at getting people to suspend disbelief and consider other viewpoints than if a person were speaking to them directly. So you imagine a game where you are directly able to interact with something, and that can be immeasurably powerful. And there's some anecdotes that I can share if there's of interest. But in terms,
I would love that.
Yeah.
Definitely of interest, though. Let's finish the game companies first.
I was going to say, you want the business case?
Let's get the business case, and then let's go, because then let's spend most of our time on games.
Oh, you and your organizational powers.
I like organization.
In terms of the business case, and a lot of this will be on the community website that we have, IGDA-climatesig.org, for anyone who's interested. But we've been gathering these talking points about the business cases that have proven to be effective to engage different stakeholders at different parts of the organization. I think first and foremost, this is particularly relevant for indie companies, is that future investment and viability in future investment is increasingly a risk. We have research and reports that financial institutions, funders are increasingly expected to consider climate risk when examining investment opportunities. And so failure to at first identify your carbon footprint and identify risks and mitigation strategies in the event we have an energy crisis and extreme weather events have an impact on investment trust. Second is market expansion. As many folks know who are in the games industry, we're constantly thinking about more eyeballs and, like, is it fun enough to build brand trust and get more people into subscriptions and things like that. But a game's and platform success in new and existing markets is wholly dependent upon whether or not we can meet players where they are. Many emerging markets have different socioeconomic and technological constraints that impact their purchasing power, never mind their willingness to adopt new tech. And so when we think about growth markets and growth countries that are increasingly mobile, increasingly connected to the internet, and increasingly interested in the social connection and competitions that come through gameplay, among many other needs and motivations, we limit our addressable market and we limit our audience reach if we're not able to do things that can be of service to the broader ecosystem that is impacted by the climate crisis. And I think I've already mentioned the ability to find and retain diverse talent. But I think one of the biggest factors we haven't talked about yet is player trust, especially when we think about new audiences. There was a 2021 report by the UN Environmental Program, Nations Development Program, and the University of Oxford, as well as PlayMob, where they funded the largest consumer survey on public opinion of climate change through mobile gamers, and so their sample size was 1.2 million players all over the world.
Whoa.
Across 50 countries through mobile.
That's amazing.
Yeah, shameless plug for gaming. a lot of eyeballs for surveys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of that 1.2 million, 64% strongly believe climate change is a global emergency. So if you consider that Gen Z is more, Gen Z and future generations more and more often are aligning themselves to brands, not because of existing brand value and brand identity, but because of values alignment.
Right.
Our failure as an industry to meet those expectations and meet those increasing expectations is only going to result in us reducing our player base over time.
Right.
Love it. Okay. Now let's move on to what game companies can do. So let's first start with what they can do, and then let's talk about the games that they can make, right? Or that they have made. Right?
Sure. Yeah. I think first and foremost, like, people need to map their carbon footprint. I know that sounds like the odd first step to take because we've been talking about these big, potentially transformative things. But first and foremost, we need to establish a baseline of like how much energy we're consuming in the first place.
Right.
Because
how is that done? How does a company actually do that? I have no idea how to measure my personal carbon footprint. How do companies do this?
That's a great question because there are many more calculators than I can probably even go into. And every company, if it's big enough, tends to have their own, which helps and doesn't help to do apples to apples comparisons of like where we actually are company to company. But there are calculators that are publicly accessible online. A lot of it is figuring out how much are you traveling? What is your power consumption when you think about your buildings? The computers or devices that you operate, how long you leave that equipment on for overnight when you're compiling a build, for instance.
Right.
All of those factors play a role, and our transportation and commute to and from work. There's many different ways to calculate your carbon footprint.
Electricity seems like the easiest one because you're going to get a bill every month that tells you exactly how much you're using.
Exactly. Yes. That's definitely the first step.
Yeah.
And there are, depending on what resources you have, the context of your business, and what you are reasonably able to take on, given most game developers have a lot of crunchy priorities. We as an industry need to improve our work-life balance. It doesn't make any of this existential work easier.
Right.
But there's ways to, being able to work from home more often, which, assuming your city and the place that you're in is hopefully trending towards cleaner energy, that will become more sustainable over time. But it's, figuring out what, power consumption settings that you currently have. Like, do all of your machines need to run at the top setting all of the time?
Right.
Calculating out, like, understanding where your materials come from, understanding what your recycling and composting practices are. There's many different ways there's many different levers from a business standpoint. From a game development standpoint, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of politics around it because there's still this pre-existing assumption that if we talk about sustainability in games, people assume it means not top graphical settings. It means not 60 frames a second at 4K. But the reality is you can make, Murderbot 9000 first-person shooter limited edition, but just run it in a more energy efficient way. Not all static menus and loading screens need to run at top, 60 plus frames a second.
Right.
There are a lot of small things we can do to minimize the impact of our builds. There's also a fundamental question about the design decisions that we make in the concepting phase of a game when we're determining like how a game looks and feels. Not every game requires hyper fidelity. And so depending on the design intentions of the game, it's good for us to also ask, like, how far does the field of vision have to be? What are players reasonably going to notice? And what are the design goals of the game? And like, are there ways for us to save energy, especially with features that players may not often notice?
Right.
I'll pause there. That's the energy efficiency side.
Nice.
And you wouldn't, honestly, as a game developer, I would not. I would not have guessed that would make that big of a difference. Like, taking static screens and running them at 30 frames a second or even 15 frames a second.
Yeah.
They're not going to be up that long. How much energy am I actually using? It seems like just such small amounts, like just drops in a bucket, really.
Multiplied by 3 billion.
But that's it, right? That's exactly it, right? Multiply that by 3 billion, and all of a sudden, you have 3 billion drops in a bucket. It's like, oh, yeah, I've got a couple of buckets.
Right.
It's amazing. It's like when I think about the numbers of people that we're talking about, just something I would I'm totally that I never would have thought about this as one way of reducing carbon footprint. But you start looking at those numbers of players, and it really adds up.
Yeah, and you think about the potential benefits and risks we have when we factor in the importance of the metaverse in daily discourse.
Right.
There's a lot of unintentional blindness, I'll say, and forgetting that Snow Crash and Ready Player One were about dystopias. And so
Right.
the more we, run into climate anxiety, the less we think about hope and what we actionably can do as individuals, as part of a collective, the more we run the risk of being in that future. And so I think that thinking about the small things that we can do that, if they add up, actually make a huge impact is something for us to keep in mind.
Right. And it seems like, as developers too, as technology has improved, basically the focus of our technology is to get us out of these limitations, right? Like, we had memory limitations, and so we increased the memory of our devices. They double it every 18 months, Moore's law, right? And so at some point we were limited by polygons we could show on screen, and so we boosted our technology that way. Now we've got more polygons than we have pixels, so it doesn't really matter anymore. So we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about memory usage anymore because we have lots of memory. Memory is cheap, and we've never really had to worry about electricity.
Yeah, which is very interesting because if you think about mobile developers, they actively have to think about this because their mobile games have direct energy draw unless you're plugged in all the time.
Right.
But when you think about like temporal accessibility and like playing on the go, playing for shorter sessions, playing while you're waiting for something else,
Right.
Energy consumption is a major factor.
But at the same time, our technological push is to make better batteries.
Exactly. Right.
And to get rid of that limitation. And that's not, but what you're saying is we need to do the opposite as well.
I would say we need to do both.
Yeah,
yes, I think we need to do both because I think that regardless of where a game developer or any of us sit on the fence of like, do we act in service of climate or not, which more granular questions than that. But regardless of where we sit, I think especially with the IPCC report and all of the anxiety with that, it's clear that while we may not have a static temperature threshold with which climate change is completely irreversible, it's clear that our way of life is going to change and it's going to keep changing. And if we think about future environmental threats that we may still have to navigate, even if we can still, live on this planet, assuming our food systems don't completely die in a fire, literally, we have to make affordances and changes that can enable us to adapt to that. And so I think that thinking about performance across PC, console, mobile are things we've always thought about. We've just never paired performance with efficiency. And that's an interesting design challenge.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm just kind of curious. Since mobile developers have to worry about energy consumption, are there lessons to take from them to, let's say, console developers or PC developers?
That's a very good point. I think that I myself am not a mobile game developer, so I probably won't be able to provide any sort of engineering efficiency without completely butchering it and having my tech directors be really mad at me. But I think that the point about understanding where your players spend the most time in the game, understanding what implications that it may have if they're going to be spending more time in a menu because they're doing resource management while they're waiting at a bus stop versus playing a game that is twitch sensitive, that requires a lot of fine motor control. All of those have peaks and valleys in terms of how much power you actually need. And so while dynamic optimization of the power requirements of your game may not be something that is easily done, I think for games that are really specifically geared towards mobile, that have a lot of static menus, that have a lot of resource management and customization around that, do have a lot of opportunities to innovate and create more efficiencies. And we can translate that to a lot of games on other platforms.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. All right. Let's now move on to this, right? I mean, the game industry is really in many ways a lot less culturally influential on social issues like this than other media. So, I mean, I've read lots of books, about climate change that are out there. The film industry has produced feature films, series, documentaries, encouraging us to be green, help the environment, fight global climate change. What has the game industry done, and what else can it do?
Sure. I mean, I think cultural influence itself is dependent upon how we're defining it and the time scale in which we're defining it, for sure. I mean, it's younger than film. And the difficult answer that I have to wrestle with on a regular basis is that we really are still in our infancy. The IGTA Climate SIG had been born as a kind of grassroots affiliate to a broader initiative called the Playing for the Planet Alliance, which was created through the UN Environmental Program. And they partnered with over 30 companies in 2017 onwards to pledge public commitments to basically say, we as an industry consider this to be a priority. The major players, including Sony, Microsoft, Rovio, us too, all pledged public commitments to become carbon neutral. And so there's a lot of work in an NDA sense that is happening to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce more transparent reporting and accountability across organizations. And there are cases where individual games have mapped things like gameplay behavior and purchases to real-world climate projects, which you can often be, they can be called like green activations or green nudging. Examples for that include Alba Wildlife Adventure by Us Too, where as part of the United Nations Green Game Jam a couple years ago, they mapped their game purchases to tree planting, and they were able to plant over 1 million trees. And there are multiple games that came out of the woodwork in the Game Jam that have done similar projects. And so we are starting to make an effort, but there's a long way we have to go, because a lot of it right now is thinking about the supply chain aspect of it. We think about the reductions for when we're building devices and we're starting to talk about how we're building our games. And there's been a lot of research to indicate that games are a great vehicle for longer term behavior change, normalization of pro-environmental values, but there's still a long way to go. And it's definitely not at the level of like content like breadth and coverage as film, and we need to catch up.
I was thinking about like the way that, on one hand, like smoking, right? There in the 60s in television, literally everybody smoked, right? Everybody smoked cigarettes. They were smoking cigarettes all the time. And in our real world here in the US, everybody smoked. I was a first grader and I was making ashtrays for my mom in ceramics.
Me too.
Right?
Yeah.
Everybody smoked.
What?
But now we cut cigarette smoking out of our media. We don't really show that anymore unless it's some specific character thing. Now a lot less people smoke.
Right.
So what can we show people doing?
Yes.
Right. And I think, and this is, I could talk about this with you forever, and I will be mindful of time. But I think I've already mentioned this earlier. But when we think about sustainability, there's a lot of media, there's a lot of options, there's a lot of things that we can do. At the same time, the impacts of this work isn't salient. It's not immediate, it's longer term, which means our ability to have the resiliency to keep going when we don't have immediate feedback is soul crushing. Games have this amazing opportunity to give you immediate feedback when you're doing something right or wrong. And that's the type of feedback loop that we should ideally be having in the sustainability movement. And unfortunately, it's really hard. But I think that I will say as well that the research that the community has done to create the environmental game design playbook, the primary author of which is a Clayton Whittle, who's amazing, we found a lot of research to indicate that there is actually a clear theory of action that we can think about to activate players and consumers in any context towards climate conscious action, towards pro-environmental behavior. The acknowledgement that we have in not trying to talk poorly of film and other forms of media when covering the climate crisis is that the truth of knowing the solution and understanding it in the best possible way does not in itself create the actual willingness to act.
Right.
And an individual's ability to apply that action and effectiveness knowledge is directly dependent upon the attitude, the intent, and the accessibility of the options actually presented. Okay. And so one of the big challenges and opportunities that we have with thinking about green activations with games, be it direct purchases, which make it as easy as possible to translate that to funds for a real world project, to more indirect activations that are much more nuanced. The main thing that I hope to continue to work with developers all over the world around is the idea that by creating opportunities for players to practice safely these behaviors, these difficult choices in a game, primes them to be more resilient when the real world opportunity presents itself. And if we map a game, if a game developer partners with a real world organization to do dedicated projects that map what happens in a game to something that can happen in the real world, and they make it really specific and local, or globally accessible, though that problem is much harder, it is much more likely that we will be able to create that sense of hope to pursue that action. And hope in itself is not it's not a feeling. Like, that's the thing that I've learned the hard way, that thankfully Clayton, Trevin, Hugo, Arnaud, shout out to everybody in the SIG who has, collected this research and put this together in such a beautiful way, is that hope itself is a cognitive construct. It's not hope as a feeling. It's right. Not just emotional. It's a state of mind with which we have the ability to see multiple paths of progression, such that even if we run into challenges, even if we run into failure multiple times, the opportunity is worth it enough to us that we are willing to keep going. And games have a great potential to enable us to safely do that, such that when the real world opportunity presents itself, we're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the strengths of games is to let us fail and fail and fail and fail and fail until we succeed, and then, right? I mean, that's what we do. That's how games work.
Yeah. So that whole feedback, there's so much in what you said, Paula, that I wanted to get into. But I want to focus on two things if you can. Number one, I'm really interested in the idea that, let's say, when we're talking to us two tomorrow, we're going to talk to them about being a B Corp. Right. And part of being a B Corp, right, is that a part of your mission is doing good in the world. Right. So one possibility connected to what you said is, whatever is in our games marketplace, we give, let's say we're going to donate 10% to, some sort of climate initiative. Right. That's one way, of course, that a company can do. But, of course, if a game allows players to voluntarily do something like that, donate money through the game, are there any games that actually do that? And then the second thing I wanted to ask after that is, can we talk about some let's say, concrete examples of how games, like, here's a game and here's how this game might actually influence people through this ability to fail and learn and model behavior?
Absolutely. You've asked 4 questions. Where do you want to start?
Let's start. Let's start with: Are there games where you actually can, literally make a difference right now by, let's say, buying something in the game that will go towards global climate change or solving global climate change, rather?
Yeah, I'll say, again, Alba the Wildlife Adventure. Every purchase goes towards tree planting. June's Journey by Wooga, I believe, is another example. And there are more that are coming out of the UN Green Game Jam, I believe, that also map to climate pledges, which are I will say, full transparency, are ambiguous in their impact, but they do provide a vehicle for players to say, like, I support this policy. I am signing this pledge because I am committed to publicly stating my intention to support this initiative, which does give impact-based organizations more visibility and viability to say, like, the consumers that we serve, the people that we serve are in support of this across X number of countries. There are other behavioral case studies of behavior change that are much smaller in scale, and I can talk about 2 in particular as examples for what we could do as an overall industry. One is the work that was done with a nonprofit named Glass Lab that was unfortunately now no longer exists. But in 2014, we as a nonprofit had gotten access to the SimCity code base, like the commercial game, and modified it for a classroom setting so that middle school science and English teachers could understand how their kids were learning systems thinking. So we had 4 missions that of increasing complexity where, middle school children would have to make investment decisions to know where they wanted to place the bus stop so that their kids could get to school on time, all the way to converting their energy grids from dirty coal energy, fossil fuels, to clean energy without their citizens sacrificing power, which would result in dissatisfied citizens, job loss, that kind of thing. We did a study with over 400 students across the United States and found that those students with classroom instruction gained statistically significant improvements in single and multivariate systems thinking as a result of gameplay. I'll say the personal anecdote I have is, like, in playtesting that game, there was a young girl in the 5th grade who'd come up to one of our game designers who said, so there's a plant behind my house. You're telling me a person put that there, which resulted in an interesting conversation about how cities are built, the decisions that get made, what it means to have public right-of-way, what it means to have zoning regulations. And this kid got really mad. And so it's small moments like that paired with the ability to practice these skills, the ability to negotiate in the context of gameplay and fail and try again until you succeed on your objectives, is something that's really powerful. One more example that I will also share is one of a student named Jack who I played, and his story is on Twitter. I wish I remembered his Twitter handle. He had played Firewatch, which is a game where you were a person in a Firewatch station and you have to explore the mysteries of what happened in that environment. He was so captivated by that experience in a game that he decided to spend his summers going around with his dad on the East Coast of the United States to visit Firewatch stations. He became one of the youngest members at the age of 12 of, like, the Firewatch Lookout Association. He eventually went to University of Massachusetts Amherst for I believe, a degree in sustainable tourism and forest conservation. And the one last thing that was really interesting is that he also was able to establish a clear understanding and empathy and connection to the Black Lives Matter movement because he saw how people of color were treated in forest conservation and forestry, which is a dominantly white field.
Right.
And so it's little moments like that that are really transformative. There's also non-environmental examples where we have people with chronic illness or disease or degenerative conditions that used to play a lot of games and used to be really active and then suddenly couldn't anymore. And being able to role play in those different environments and fantasy environments where you can, go into a survival game, go into an action and adventure game and survive something traumatic and have full control over those decisions. That is also something that is very restorative for mental health. And so if we can scale that to 3 billion players in some way, that could be really powerful. It's a big problem, but it's a big challenge.
Right. That's amazing.
It's interesting. I'm immediately thinking of there's a couple of directions I want to go. Some of the things that seem obvious to me, and I'm sure I'm saying this as someone who has not looked into this, but you have. But obviously, the stories we tell and where environmentalism fits in the stories and how important the environment is in all those stories as a value seems to be a really, really big deal. I mean, this is just part of the worlds we play in, right? I was thinking earlier when you were talking about SimCity, I was actually thinking about The Sims for a moment. I was thinking, if I was playing The Sims, would I be recycling, right? And notice, right, if a game assumes that I'm recycling, right, I am practicing recycling. Right. If I'm playing The Sims, is it keeping track of my carbon footprint? Right. If so, right, I'm getting used to thinking, right, about about my carbon footprint. So it's interesting, right? So many of these things where am I in the game? Is there something positive attached to the idea of let's say planting a tree? I was born in Israel, where planting trees has always been like a really, really big deal. So as a kid, we would go to the forest, the entire class, and plant trees. And there was something very, very culturally important about planting trees, right? We turned our desert into like a thriving a thriving environment. So those seem to me like kind of easy. I say easy. I'm not a developer, so it's easy for me to say them. I was actually wondering about a specific besides this, and I'm going to ask. I know I'm asking two questions in a sense, but if there is a game that deals with the tragedy of the commons and climate change. Because to me, because I'm coming at climate change from, in some sense, I think games should focus on the easy stuff. Get people to recycle, get people to use like electricity, get people to, stop eating beef, maybe stop eating meat, right? There's lots of stuff. But as a philosopher, I'm super interested in in the problem that we essentially are in this situation where every country, it's in its self-interest to use energy, while it's in everybody's self-interest that everybody not use more energy. And the tragedy of the commons is that every person in the world essentially has every reason to use energy, but if we all do it, we're all fucked. Mm-hmm. It seems like the kind of thing that could really fit well into a game somehow.
I mean, the thing that is soul crushing to admit is that most of our games historically already have that problem. If we think about Final Fantasy VII, that is a small group of protagonists that are actively fighting against a major corporation that has extracted natural resources from their lived planet. And that is essentially a major eco-narrative that activated a bunch of game developers like very early on in the process, and,
awesome.
And without the language to articulate exactly the implications of that work.
Right. I think about other powerful things like Princess Mononoke.
Yes.
Or right, and the huge environmental statement that it makes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if we also think about even companies that don't think they're making an eco-narrative tend to. If we take an extreme example, like the Gears of War franchise, it's kind of a metaphor for fracking. It's like we dug too deep into an alien planet's natural resources, and the indigenous creatures are fighting back. And we've extracted too much to an extreme degree, and so
which was Avatar, and
oh, right.
right. So
Yeah. And so we've already been aware of these choices for a very long time. The difference is they haven't been explicit. And systems thinking is a really hard thing for us to do when there are so many things that we have to factor into our day-to-day that we just want to escape. And I think that's part of the fear that we have as a game development industry, is that we're not at that point of recognizing that games are inherently lenses of what we think are possible. And there are more and more games that are coming out with these solar punk futures that like are trying to explore a world that is not completely ravaged by apocalypse, because we're recognizing that like we do want something else. But there are a lot of portrayals that we have, even like games like Overwatch that, you know, don't make that explicit, that are based in a game world where we assume we have fixed the energy crisis problem. And so we have the ability to make those assumptions more salient and go, you want to get there? Next generation of game developers, students, players.
Right.
There are many ways for us to get there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Amazing.
Because I mean, I really didn't think I'm so used to thinking of the post-apocalyptic world as just a kind of just a nice trick for putting us in a particular type of story, as opposed to also a message of hopelessness.
Right.
Right.
And we really want to be a hero in that story, because the world in day-to-day life sometimes feels really helpless. And sometimes we have needs that are unfulfilled in the real world. So we escape to a place where we have more control. The challenge I honestly have, though, is what if we were to imagine worlds in which the world hasn't fallen apart? What would you do in that environment? What are the different challenges that you would have and face to create a better future for everybody? Like those are the design questions that I'm very curious about.
Yeah, those are great.
So, Paula, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
The idea that the world is not necessarily always falling apart, and that you have more power than you think you do. I know that feels really squishy. I know that feels like it's a platitude, but it's not. We have, a sweeping assessment through the IPCC by over 200 scientists that indicate we are in dire straits. At the same time, our influence of the environment is directly correlated to our GHG emissions, which we have the ability to control with collective effort. There are many things that we can do at an individual level as consumers, as people who make games, as people who love games, to make these small incremental gains, so that, by the time the next major console releases, by the time the next technological innovation happens, we're still making progress over time. And all it requires is for you to find, peers who can support you, allies who can help advocate for you, allies who can help, create a plan that makes sense for your needs and can be contextualized to what you're able to do. Every small effort matters, and it all adds up. So that's my hope.
All right, 3 billion drops. All right, yeah, add to a whole lot. Paula, you are wonderful. I just got to say, I'm so appreciating the work that you and your organization and others like it in the game world are doing for the planet.
What should our listeners read?
Ooh, I mean, the Environmental Game Design Playbook presented by the IGTA Climate Special Interest Group is definitely a good starting point if you have concerns, questions, doubts, curiosities related to climate-conscious game design. That is available on igdaclimatesig.org, which has a bunch of other resources as well if you're looking at game design talks, energy efficiency, like research studies and reports. We're basically just making these resources easier to find.
Great.
Other than that, there's also Dr. Ben Abraham's book. I believe it's called Digital Games After Climate Change, which is the first comprehensive research study that maps our carbon footprint end to end as an industry. So highly recommend that. And there's many other resources that I would provide, but it is all on the website.
All on the website. We can go to IGDA Climate SIG and find it all.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, guys. Paula, thank you so much for coming on our show. Great podcast, guys.
Yay!
All right. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.